Useless old woman, aren't you going to make lunch? My daughter-in-law shouted at me in front of the guests. After I served the meal, she threw a plate of food on the floor and said, "Clean that up." The next day at the office, she got a surprise that made her go pale. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." Useless old woman, aren't you going to make lunch? Briella's shrill voice cut through the air like a blade, stopping every conversation in the dining room. I felt my face burn with shame as 12 pairs of eyes turned toward me, some amused, others uncomfortable, all witnessing my public humiliation. I was standing in the doorway of what used to be my own dining room, holding a pitcher of water I'd just refilled. The room fell silent except for the soft clink of silverware being set down on plates. My son Marcus cleared his throat awkwardly but said nothing. He never said anything when his wife spoke to me this way. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "The roast needs 10 more minutes." Briella's perfectly manicured hand waved dismissively in the air. She was wearing the diamond bracelet I'd given her for her birthday last year, the one that cost me 3 months of Social Security. 10 more minutes? Our guests have been waiting for an hour already because you can't manage to cook a simple meal. I wanted to remind her that she'd invited 8 additional people at the last minute, that I'd been cooking since dawn to accommodate everyone, that my arthritis was flaring up so badly I could barely grip the knife to slice vegetables, but I knew better. Speaking up would only make it worse. "Mom's getting slower these days," Marcus said with a forced laugh, not even looking at me. "You know how it is with older folks." Older folks. I'm 60 years old, not 90. I raised 3 children, ran a household, and somehow lost myself so completely along the way that even my own son sees me as nothing more than an inconvenience. I shuffled toward the kitchen, my slippers making soft sounds against the hardwood floor. Behind me, I heard Briella's voice pick up again, smooth and charming as she redirected the conversation back to herself. She had that gift. The ability to command a room, to make everyone hang on her every word. When Marcus first brought her home 5 years ago, I thought she was wonderful, beautiful, successful, confident. Everything I used to be. The kitchen felt like a sanctuary, even though it technically wasn't mine anymore. When Marcus and Briella moved in 3 years ago after their business temporarily failed, they'd slowly taken over everything. First the master bedroom, then the home office, then gradually the rest of the house. I found myself relegated to the small guest room in the back, the one that used to be Marcus's childhood bedroom. I opened the oven, checking the roast one more time. It was actually ready, had been ready for 20 minutes, but I needed those extra few minutes to compose myself. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't let them see me cry. Not again. The dining room erupted in laughter at something Briella said. She was probably telling the story about how she rescued Marcus from his boring corporate job and convinced him to start their consulting business. She never mentioned how that business folded within 18 months, or how they'd burned through their savings so quickly they couldn't afford their apartment anymore. I arranged the roast on the serving platter, adding the roasted vegetables around the edges the way my mother had taught me decades ago. The presentation was beautiful, restaurant quality. I'd always been good at making things look perfect, even when everything underneath was falling apart. "Finally," Briella announced as I entered the dining room with the platter. "I was starting to think we'd have to order pizza." More polite laughter from the guests. I served everyone in silence, moving around the table like a ghost. When I reached Briella's plate, she looked up at me with those cold blue eyes. "The meat looks dry," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "And these vegetables are overcooked. Honestly, Nellie, I don't know how you managed to ruin such a simple meal." I stood there holding the serving fork, feeling something crack inside my chest. The roast was perfect, tender and juicy, the vegetables crisp and perfectly seasoned. I'd been cooking for 40 years. I knew what I was doing. "I'm sorry," I heard myself say again. Those seemed to be the only words I was allowed anymore. "Just put it down and go fix your mistake." Briella waved toward the kitchen. "Bring me that grilled chicken from yesterday instead." At least that was edible. But I knew there was no leftover chicken. She was just sending me away. asserting her dominance in front of her audience. I set the platter down and turned to leave, my cheeks burning with humiliation. That's when it happened. As I walked past Briella's chair, I heard the deliberate scrape of ceramic against wood, then the crash. The sound of her dinner plate hitting the hardwood floor, sending roast beef, vegetables, and gravy splattering across the dining room. "Oh no!" Briella gasped, her voice dripping with false concern. "Look what happened! Nellie, you need to clean this up right away before it stains." I stared at the mess on the floor, at the food scattered across the hardwood my late husband had installed with his own hands 30 years ago. Everyone was looking at me, waiting to see what I would do. Some faces showed pity, others embarrassment for me. A couple of the younger guests were struggling not to smile. "Clean it up," Briella repeated, her voice harder now. "We can't eat with this mess on the floor." I got on my hands and knees in front of 12 people and began picking up pieces of food with my bare hands. The gravy had already started to seep between the floorboards. I could feel Briella's eyes on me, could sense her satisfaction at having reduced me to this, a 60-year-old woman crawling on the floor like a servant. "Poor thing," someone whispered, but not loudly enough for Marcus to hear, and certainly not loudly enough to matter. As I scraped the last of the gravy with paper towels, I felt something shift inside me, not the familiar resignation, not the hollow acceptance I'd grown used to, something else, something that had been sleeping for too long. I finished cleaning and excused myself, mumbling something about checking on dessert, but instead of going to the kitchen, I went to my small bedroom and closed the door behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my reflection in the dresser mirror across the room. The woman looking back at me was a stranger. Gray hair pulled back in a simple bun, tired eyes, shoulders permanently curved from years of bending to other people's will, to other people's expectations, to other people's cruelty. When had I become this person? When had I agreed to disappear so completely? I walked to my dresser and pulled out the bottom drawer, pushing aside old sweaters until my fingers found what I was looking for. A slim leather folder, hidden beneath layers of wool and memories. I hadn't opened it in 3 years, not since Marcus and Briella moved in, and I decided to let them believe I was just a helpless old woman living on Social Security. Inside the folder were documents they'd never seen: bank statements, property deeds, investment portfolios, corporate filings, all bearing the same name, Nellie R. Harrison, CEO and majority shareholder of Harrison Holdings, LLC. I ran my finger over the letterhead of the most recent quarterly report. $47 million in assets, 12 commercial properties, 3 apartment complexes, and 1 mid-sized office building downtown that housed, among other businesses, the marketing firm where Briella had just started working last month. For 3 years, I'd let them treat me like a burden. I'd pretended to struggle with bills while quietly managing a business empire I'd built from nothing. I'd watched my daughter-in-law humiliate me, dismiss me, erase me, all while she worked in a building I owned, for a company that paid me rent every month. I closed the folder and slid it back into its hiding place. Tomorrow was Monday. Tomorrow, Briella would go to work like always, expecting to continue her charmed life while the old woman at home cleaned her messes. But tomorrow, everything was going to change. I woke up at 5:30 Monday morning, the same time I'd been waking up for the past 40 years. But this morning felt different. The house was still quiet. Marcus and Briella wouldn't be up for another 2 hours, and I had work to do. I made my coffee in the dark kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd been humiliated 2 days ago. The stain on the hardwood was still visible despite my scrubbing, a reminder of how low I'd allowed myself to sink. But as I stood there sipping my coffee, I wasn't thinking about the stain. I was thinking about the phone call I needed to make. "Good morning, Mrs. Harrison." James Peterson's voice was crisp and professional, even at 6 in the morning. He'd been my property manager for 15 years, one of the few people who knew the full extent of my holdings. "How can I help you?" "I need you to prepare a termination notice," I said quietly, keeping my voice low. "For Briella Richardson at Meridian Marketing, effective immediately." There was a pause. "May I ask the reason?" "Misconduct. Unprofessional behavior. Whatever the standard language is for someone who's proven themselves unsuitable for the workplace. I'll have it ready within the hour." Should I coordinate with building security? Yes. And James, I want to handle this personally. Another pause. Of course, Mrs. Harrison. Will you be coming in today? I'll be there at 9. I hung up and finished my coffee in the growing dawn light. Upstairs, I could hear the shower running. Briella was getting ready for what she thought would be another ordinary day at her prestigious new job. She'd been so proud when she got the position at Meridian Marketing, bragging to everyone about her corner office and her impressive salary. She had no idea that every dollar of that salary came from rent paid to me. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 3 years, she'd been calling me a useless old woman while working in my building, using my electricity, benefiting from my investments. Every snide comment about my cooking, every dismissive wave of her hand, every moment she'd made me feel small and worthless, all while she was, quite literally, dependent on me for her livelihood. At 7:30, I heard them in the kitchen. Briella's voice carried through the house, sharp and demanding as always. "Where's breakfast? I have an important client meeting this morning and I can't be late." I heard Marcus mumble something about cereal. Cereal? Are you kidding me? Doesn't your mother cook anymore? Or has she just given up completely? I waited 5 minutes, then walked into the kitchen wearing my old bathrobe and slippers, playing the role I'd perfected over the past 3 years, the tired, confused old woman who couldn't quite keep up with the modern world. "Good morning," I said softly, avoiding eye contact. Briella barely looked up from her phone. "Finally, I need eggs Benedict and fresh fruit. And make sure the hollandaise isn't lumpy like last time." "I'm not sure we have all the ingredients," I began. "Then figure it out," she snapped. "That's what grocery stores are for, isn't it?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. He'd learned long ago that staying silent was easier than defending his mother. The path of least resistance had become his specialty. I nodded meekly and began opening cabinets, making a show of checking ingredients I already knew we didn't have. Briella huffed with exasperation. "This is ridiculous. I'll grab something on the way to work. Again." She gathered her purse and keys with theatrical frustration. "I don't know why I even bother expecting basic consideration in this house." After they left, the house fell silent again. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment, then walked to my bedroom and opened the closet. In the back, behind dresses I hadn't worn in years, hung 3 business suits, navy, charcoal, and black. I selected the navy one and laid it on the bed. It had been 3 years since I'd dressed for the office, 3 years since I'd stepped foot in Harrison Holdings. My employees thought I was taking an extended leave of absence for health reasons. Only James knew the truth, that I'd wanted to see what it felt like to be invisible, to live as just another forgotten older woman. I'd gotten my answer. It felt like drowning. The suit still fit perfectly. I'd maintained my figure through sheer nervous energy and the physical demands of cooking and cleaning for a household that barely acknowledged my existence. In the mirror, I watched myself transform. The tired old woman in the bathrobe disappeared, replaced by someone I recognized from before, someone with presence, with authority, with power. I applied makeup for the first time in months. Not heavy, just enough to enhance the sharp cheekbones I'd inherited from my grandmother, and the steel gray eyes that had intimidated business rivals for decades. I pulled my hair back into a sleek chignon and added the only jewelry I'd kept from my previous life. Simple pearl earrings and my grandmother's watch. The woman in the mirror was 60 years old, but she commanded respect. She was someone who built empires, not someone who cleaned up messes on her hands and knees. At 8:45, I drove downtown to the Harrison building. My building. I'd had the parking garage attendant save my old spot, the one marked N. Harrison, President, in faded letters. As I pulled in, he did a double take. "Mrs. Harrison? Ma'am, we weren't expecting you today." "I know, Carlos. Is my office ready?" "Always, ma'am. Mr. Peterson has been keeping everything exactly as you left it." The elevator to the top floor felt familiar and foreign at the same time. The executive suite was exactly as I'd left it. Mahogany desk, leather chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city I'd watched grow and change over the past 20 years. James was waiting with a stack of papers and a knowing look. "The termination notice is ready," he said, setting the documents on my desk. "Building security has been notified. Ms. Richardson should be arriving within the next 10 minutes. I signed the papers with my full signature, Eleanor Nellie Rose Harrison, CEO. It felt good to write my own name again, to claim my identity after years of being dismissed as just Marcus's mother, or the old woman who lives with them. There's something else you should know, James said carefully. Ms. Richardson has been quite vocal about her living situation. She's told several colleagues about the challenging circumstances at home. Her exact words were that she's stuck caring for her husband's pathetic mother who can barely function on her own. I felt that familiar crack in my chest, but this time it wasn't breaking me open. It was breaking something else loose, something that had been contained for far too long. Has she now? She's also mentioned that she and your son are looking for a way to convince you to move into assisted living. She believes the house is too much for you to maintain. My house. The house my husband and I bought 30 years ago, the house we raised our children in, the house I'd paid off twice over with my business earnings, the house that Briella and Marcus now considered theirs by default. Thank you for letting me know, James. Should I escort her out personally? No. I stood up and smoothed my skirt. I'll handle this myself. Through my office window, I could see the Meridian marketing offices across the building's central atrium. I watched Briella step off the elevator, coffee in hand, chatting animatedly with a colleague. She was wearing a designer suit I'd never seen before, probably purchased with her first month's salary from the job in my building. I picked up the termination notice and walked to the elevator. It was time for Briella to learn something about the woman she'd been calling useless. It was time for her to meet the real Nellie Harrison. The elevator dinged softly as I reached the 15th floor. Through the glass doors of Meridian Marketing, I could see Briella at her desk, perfectly manicured nails clicking against her keyboard as she typed what looked like an email. She was laughing at something on her screen, probably sharing another story about the crazy old woman she had to deal with at home. I straightened my shoulders and walked through the reception area. The young woman at the front desk looked up with a polite smile that quickly turned to confusion as she tried to place me. "Good morning. I'm here to see Briella Richardson," I said, my voice carrying the authority I'd forgotten I possessed. "Of course. May I tell her who's calling?" "Eleanor Harrison. She'll know who I am." The receptionist picked up her phone, and I watched through the glass partition as she spoke to Briella. I saw my daughter-in-law's face change from casual interest to complete bewilderment. She turned in her chair, scanning the reception area until her eyes found mine. The color drained from her face. She stood up slowly, her movements mechanical, like someone in a dream or a nightmare. I watched her walk toward the reception area, her confident stride faltering with each step. When she reached me, her mouth opened and closed twice before any words came out. "Nellie, what? What are you doing here? How did you—" She looked around the office, then back at me, taking in my business suit, my composed demeanor, my presence in a space where I clearly didn't belong. "I don't understand. We need to talk," I said calmly, "in private." She glanced nervously at the receptionist, who was pretending not to listen while obviously hanging on every word. "I'm in the middle of a very important project. Maybe we could discuss whatever this is at home tonight?" "No, Briella. We're going to discuss it now, in your office." Something in my tone made her take a step backward. For the first time in 3 years, I saw uncertainty in her eyes. She nodded mutely and led me through the maze of cubicles toward her corner office. I could feel curious eyes following us, her colleagues wondering who this stern-looking woman was and why their usually confident coworker looked like she'd seen a ghost. Briella's office was everything she'd bragged about: large windows, expensive furniture, a view of the city skyline. She closed the door behind us and turned to face me, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Nellie, I'm really confused. How did you even get here? Did Marcus drive you? And why are you dressed like—" She gestured vaguely at my suit. "Sit down, Briella. I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. I'm at work, and I really can't." "Sit down." This time, she obeyed. I remained standing, positioning myself between her and the door. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that neither of us quite knew how to navigate it yet. "Do you like your office?" I asked conversationally. She blinked. "What?" "Your office. It's very nice. Corner location. Great view. Impressive for someone who's only been here a month." Yes, it's very nice. Nellie, what is this about? You're scaring me. Am I? I walked to her window and looked out at the city below. You know, I've always loved this view. I used to spend hours looking out windows just like this one, making decisions that affected hundreds of people's lives. I don't understand what you're talking about. I turned back to her, and for a moment we just looked at each other. This woman who had spent 3 years making me feel worthless was staring at me like I was a stranger. In a way, I supposed I was. Tell me about your job, Briella. You were so excited when you got it. Starting salary of $85,000, full benefits, corner office. Quite a step up from your previous position. How do you know my salary? The question came out as barely a whisper. I know a lot of things. I know that you told your friends at the gym that you finally escaped the dead weight of living with an old woman who contributes nothing. I know that you've been looking at apartments, planning to convince Marcus that I need to be moved to a care facility so you can have the house to yourselves. I know that last week you told your sister that dealing with me is like having a child who never grew up. Each revelation hit her like a physical blow. Her face went from pale to red to pale again. Who told you that? Have you been spying on me? I don't need to spy, Briella. People talk, and when you're as dismissive of an old woman as you've been of me, you assume she's invisible. You assume she doesn't matter, doesn't have connections, doesn't have influence? I pulled the termination notice from my jacket pocket and placed it on her desk. She stared at it without picking it up, as if it might bite her. What is that? Your termination notice. Effective immediately. You can't. What? Nellie, you can't fire me. You don't work here. You don't even understand how offices work? This is insane. I sat down across from her desk, crossing my legs and folding my hands in my lap. Read the letterhead on that document. With trembling fingers, she picked up the paper. I watched her eyes scan the top of the page, then widen in disbelief. Harrison Holdings, LLC, she read aloud, her voice cracking. That's right, but that's the company that owns this building. They're our landlord. Indeed they are. She looked up at me, her face a mask of confusion and growing horror. Nellie, what does this have to do with anything? Why do you have their letterhead? Look at the signature line. She looked down again, and I watched the exact moment when understanding hit her. Her hands started shaking so violently that the paper rustled. Eleanor R. Harrison, Chief Executive Officer, she read in a whisper. That's me, Briella. Eleanor Rose Harrison. Nellie is just what my family calls me, or used to call me, before I became the useless old woman who couldn't even cook your breakfast properly. She was staring at me like I'd just told her I was an alien. That's impossible. You live in our guest room. You clip coupons. You can barely figure out how to use the remote control. I clip coupons because I've always been careful with money. That's how you build wealth, Briella. As for the remote control, I smiled. Well, it was easier to let you believe I was incompetent than to fight you for it every night. She set the paper down with shaking hands. This is some kind of joke. Marcus would have told me if you owned. Marcus doesn't know. He thinks I'm living on Social Security and the life insurance from his father. He thinks I'm a burden you're both graciously carrying. But the bills, the groceries, the mortgage payments? What about them? You're always worried about money. You count every penny. No, Briella. I count every penny because I know the value of money. I've never been worried about it. I have more than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. She was breathing hard now, her chest rising and falling rapidly. I don't believe you. This is insane. You're having some kind of breakdown. I pulled out my phone and speed dialed a number. James, could you please confirm for our guest that Eleanor Harrison is indeed the CEO and majority owner of Harrison Holdings? Yes, she's sitting right here. I held the phone out to her. She took it like it was a snake. Hello? Her voice was barely audible. I couldn't hear James's side of the conversation, but I watched Briella's face crumble with each word. After about 30 seconds, she handed the phone back to me without speaking. Thank you, James. Yes, please have security escort Ms. Richardson out of the building. She'll need to collect her personal items. I hung up and looked at my daughter-in-law, who was staring at her hands in her lap. I don't understand, she whispered. Why didn't you tell us? Why let us treat you like what, Briella? Like a servant? Like an inconvenience? Like someone whose feelings don't matter? She flinched. I wanted to see who you really were. I wanted to see what kind of person my son had married. What kind of people would move into my house and treat me like I was worthless? We didn't know. You didn't know because you didn't care to know. You made assumptions based on what you wanted to believe. You wanted to believe I was pathetic so you could feel superior. A knock on the office door interrupted us. Two security guards stood outside, their presence drawing curious stares from the rest of the office. You have 15 minutes to collect your personal belongings, I said, standing up. James will handle your final paycheck and benefits termination. Nellie, please, we can talk about this. I know I haven't been perfect, but no, we can't talk about this. And you haven't been imperfect, Briella. You've been cruel. I walked to the door, then paused and turned back to her. Oh, and Briella, this is just the beginning. You have no idea how much power I actually have, or how deeply your actions have affected not just me, but your entire future. I left her sitting there, staring at the termination notice, while I walked out of the office with my head held high. Behind me, I could hear whispers starting, phones buzzing with gossip, the beginning of a story that would spread through the building within hours. But this was just the first move in a much larger game. Briella was about to learn that when you systematically destroy someone's dignity, there are consequences far beyond anything she could imagine. I was arranging flowers in the living room when Briella burst through the front door at 2:30 in the afternoon. I'd been expecting her, of course. Getting fired tends to free up one's schedule considerably. She stood in the doorway, still wearing her expensive suit, but everything else about her had changed. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared from crying, and her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her purse. "We need to talk," she said, her voice raw from sobbing. I continued trimming the stems of the white roses I'd bought that morning. "Do we?" "Don't play games with me, Nellie. Not anymore." I looked up at her, noting how she seemed smaller somehow, as if the weight of her new reality had physically diminished her. "I'm not playing games, Briella. I'm arranging flowers. It's something I enjoy doing in my own home." The emphasis on my own home wasn't lost on her. She flinched and took a step backward. "Why didn't you tell us?" she whispered. "Why let us believe you were? Poor, helpless, dependent on your charity?" I set down the scissors and gave her my full attention. "Because I wanted to see who you really were when you thought I had no power. And you showed me, didn't you?" She sank onto the couch without being invited, her legs apparently unable to support her anymore. "I lost my job today. They escorted me out like a criminal. Everyone was staring, whispering. It was humiliating." "Was it?" I picked up another rose, examining it carefully. "Imagine how humiliating it must be to have someone throw food on the floor and make you clean it up on your hands and knees in front of a dinner party. That was different." "How?" I was frustrated. I'd been planning that dinner for weeks, and everything was going wrong, and you decided to take it out on the woman who'd been cooking for 12 people since dawn, because you invited extra guests at the last minute. I placed the rose in the vase with deliberate precision. "Tell me, Briella, what exactly was different about your humiliation today and mine 2 days ago?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again. For once in her life, she seemed to understand that there was no good answer. "I tried calling Marcus," she said eventually. "He won't answer his phone. He's in a meeting. I believe he's trying to explain to his business partners why his wife was just fired for misconduct." Her face went ashen. "You didn't tell them it was misconduct. You can't prove—" "Actually, I can. Would you like to see the security footage from the elevator last week when you were discussing with your friend how you planned to convince Marcus to put me in a nursing home? Or perhaps the recording from the parking garage where you told your sister that living with me was like babysitting a senile child?" Briella's hands flew to her mouth. "You've been recording us?" "I own the building where you worked. Security cameras are standard in office buildings, Briella, and voices carry in parking garages." She was crying again now, mascara running down her cheeks in dark streaks. "This is insane. You're destroying my life over some silly comments. Everyone complains about their in-laws." Silly comments. I repeated the words slowly, letting them hang in the air. "Is that what you call 3 years of systematic emotional abuse? I never abused you. You made me feel worthless. You treated me like a servant in my own home. You convinced my son that I was a burden, that I was failing mentally, that I needed to be managed and controlled. I set down the flowers and walked closer to where she sat. You tried to erase me, Briella. You wanted me to disappear so you could have the life you thought you deserved. I was just trying to help Marcus build a future for us. You have to understand. I understand perfectly. You saw an older woman and assumed she was weak. You saw someone grieving her husband's death and thought she was broken. You moved into her home and decided she was no longer the owner, just an inconvenience to be tolerated. Briella wiped her nose with the back of her hand, a gesture that would have horrified her under normal circumstances. What do you want from me? Do you want me to apologize? Fine. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I hurt your feelings. Can we move past this now? Hurt my feelings. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. You think this is about hurt feelings? Isn't it? I walked to the window and looked out at the garden my husband and I had planted together 25 years ago. The roses were blooming beautifully this year, despite being neglected during my 3-year disappearance from my own life. 3 weeks ago, you told Marcus that you thought I was developing dementia. You suggested he should have me evaluated for cognitive decline. I was concerned. You were setting the stage to have me declared incompetent so you could gain control of my assets. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending otherwise. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the sound of her ragged breathing. Last month, you called the county social services office and reported that an elderly woman was living in unsafe conditions and might need welfare assistance. Briella's face went white. How did you? Because they called me directly, Briella. Eleanor Harrison, the woman whose name is on the property deed, the bank accounts, and every utility bill for this house. They wanted to verify that I was safe and had adequate resources for my care. I was trying to help. You were trying to build a case. A paper trail showing that I was incompetent, that I needed assistance, that I couldn't manage my own affairs. I turned away from the window to face her. Tell me, what was the next step in your plan? Power of attorney? Guardianship? Were you going to have Marcus declared my caretaker so you could control my finances? She was sobbing openly now, her composure completely shattered. It wasn't like that. I thought you needed help. The only help I needed was protection from you. The front door opened, and I heard Marcus's voice calling out, Bree, are you home? What the hell happened today? He appeared in the living room doorway, his tie loosened and his hair disheveled. He looked at his wife crying on the couch, then at me standing calmly by the window, and his confusion was almost comical. Mom? What's going on? Briella called me hysterical, saying she got fired and that you were somehow involved. Sit down, Marcus. We need to have a conversation that's about 3 years overdue. He remained standing, looking back and forth between us. I don't understand any of this. How could you be involved in Briella's job? You don't even know where she works. I know exactly where she worked. The Harrison Building, 15th floor, Meridian Marketing. She had a corner office with a lovely view of the city. How do you know that? Because I own the building, Marcus. I own the company that manages the property. I own the corporation that employs the management company. And I owned every square inch of your wife's former workplace. Marcus stared at me for a long moment, then laughed. That's ridiculous, Mom. You live on Dad's life insurance and Social Security. You can barely afford groceries. I've never had trouble affording groceries, son. I clip coupons because I was raised to be careful with money, not because I don't have any. This is insane, he said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. If you had money, real money, why would you let us move in here? Why would you live like what? Like someone you both treated as if she was already dead? The words hit him like a physical blow. He sank into his father's old armchair, the same chair he'd claimed for himself when they moved in, and looked at me with something approaching recognition. I wanted to see who you really were, I continued. Both of you. I wanted to know what kind of man my son had become, what kind of woman he'd married. I wanted to understand what would happen if I became vulnerable, if I needed help, if I wasn't the strong woman who raised 3 children on her own while building a business empire. Business empire? Marcus's voice was barely a whisper. Harrison Holdings. I started it 30 years ago with a small loan and your father's blessing. It's worth $47 million, Marcus. All of it built while I was raising you and your sisters. All of it hidden because I learned early that people treat wealthy women differently than they treat ordinary mothers and grandmothers. Briella had stopped crying and was staring at me with something approaching horror. Not remorse, I noticed. horror at the magnitude of her mistake. "Mom," Marcus began, but I held up my hand. "I'm not finished. Briella's termination today was just the beginning. You see, when you systematically destroy someone's dignity, when you spend years making them feel worthless and unwanted, there are consequences. And those consequences extend far beyond a single job." I walked to my purse and pulled out a thick manila envelope, setting it on the coffee table between them. "What's that?" Briella asked, her voice barely audible. "Your eviction notice, both of you. You have 30 days to find somewhere else to live." "You can't evict us," Marcus protested. "This is a family home. We're your family." "No, Marcus. Family doesn't treat each other the way your wife has treated me. Family doesn't plot to have their mother declared incompetent. Family doesn't make the woman who gave them life feel like she's already dead." I picked up my flowers and headed toward the kitchen. "I suggest you start looking for apartments. And Briella? I'd recommend starting with something you can afford on Marcus's salary alone. Because as of today, your career in this city is over." Behind me, I heard Briella whisper, "What does that mean?" But I didn't answer. They would find out soon enough that my influence extended far beyond a single building, far beyond a single job. They would learn that when you destroy someone who has spent decades building relationships, earning respect, and accumulating power, the consequences can reach into every corner of your life. They thought they were dealing with a helpless old woman. They were about to discover they had been living with a force of nature who had simply been choosing to remain dormant. Until now. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of phone calls, legal documents, and watching my son and daughter-in-law slowly realize the true extent of their situation. They had stopped speaking to me entirely, communicating only through terse notes left on the kitchen counter and awkward encounters in the hallways of what they were finally understanding was my house. I was sitting in my home office, the room they'd converted into a storage space for Briella's exercise equipment, when my phone rang. I'd reclaimed the space the day after our confrontation, moving her yoga mats and designer handbags to the garage where they belonged. "Mrs. Harrison?" The voice belonged to Janet Morrison, a longtime colleague who managed one of the city's most prestigious employment agencies. "I thought you should know that Briella Richardson came in today asking for help with job placement." I leaned back in my leather chair, the same one I'd bought 20 years ago when Harrison Holdings first turned $1 million profit. "I see. And how did that go?" "Well, it was interesting. She seems to believe she was wrongfully terminated and is looking for legal recourse. She also mentioned that she has connections who can vouch for her character and work ethic." I smiled. Briella still didn't understand how small the professional world really was, especially for someone like me who'd been building relationships in this city for 3 decades. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that unfortunately, we had no positions that matched her qualifications at this time." Which is true, technically, after the calls I've been receiving about her situation. Most of our client companies have expressed that they wouldn't be interested in her services. Calls? Oh yes, word travels fast in our industry. When someone gets terminated from a Harrison Holdings property, especially with a misconduct notation, people pay attention. Your company has a reputation for being extremely selective about tenants and employees. I hadn't even had to make those calls. The business community in our city was smaller than people realized, and my reputation preceded me. When Eleanor Harrison terminated someone for misconduct, there was always a very good reason. "She also asked if I knew anything about you," Janet continued. She seemed confused about the relationship between her mother-in-law and the Harrison Holdings CEO. I told her I'd never heard of anyone by that name. "Thank you, Janet. I appreciate your discretion." "Of course. Though I have to say, I'm curious about the family connection. Is this woman really related to you?" "Unfortunately, yes, but not for much longer." After I hung up, I turned to my computer and opened the email that had been waiting for me all morning. It was from David Chen, my attorney, confirming that the eviction notice had been properly served and that Marcus and Briella had exactly 12 days remaining to vacate the premises. A soft knock on my office door interrupted my reading. I looked up to see Marcus standing in the doorway, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair unkempt, and there was a desperate quality to his expression that reminded me of the little boy he'd once been when he'd broken something valuable and was hoping to avoid consequences. "Mom, can we talk?" I gestured to the chair across from my desk. He sat down heavily, his eyes scanning the office as if seeing it for the first time. Which, in a way, he was. The last time he'd been in this room, it had been filled with Briella's belongings and the assumption that I was too confused to need a proper workspace. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began carefully, "about family and how we've been treating you. Have you? I know Briella can be difficult sometimes, and maybe we haven't been as considerate as we should have been." I set down my reading glasses and gave him my full attention. "Difficult? Is that what you call it?" He shifted uncomfortably. "I mean, I know she has strong opinions about how things should be done, and maybe she came across as controlling." "Marcus, stop." "What?" "Stop making excuses for her. Stop minimizing what she did. Stop pretending that 3 years of systematic emotional abuse was just someone being difficult or having strong opinions." His face flushed red. "She wasn't abusing you, Mom. That's a really strong word for what? For convincing you that I was mentally incompetent. For calling county services to report me as an elderly person in need of welfare assistance? For throwing food on the floor and making me clean it up on my hands and knees in front of dinner guests?" Each example hit him like a slap. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. "For telling your business partners that you were worried about my declining mental state? For suggesting to our family doctor that I should be evaluated for dementia? For researching nursing homes and assisted living facilities without my knowledge or consent? How do you know about all that?" "Because I've been paying attention, Marcus. Because while you both thought I was fading away into confused old age, I was actually watching and listening and documenting every single thing she did to try to erase me from my own life." He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "I didn't know she was doing some of those things, but you knew about the others. You were there when she threw the plate on the floor. You heard her call me useless. You watched her treat me like a servant in my own home, and you said nothing. I thought you were okay with it. You never complained. You never stood up for yourself. I was testing you, Marcus. I was giving you the chance to be the man I raised you to be, the man who would defend his mother, who would protect someone vulnerable, who would stand up to a bully even when that bully was his wife." The words hung between us like a verdict. He looked up at me, and for the first time in years, I saw my little boy in his eyes, confused, ashamed, and finally understanding the magnitude of his failure. "She's my wife, Mom. Marriage is about supporting each other, presenting a united front. Marriage is not about sacrificing your mother's dignity to keep your wife happy. Marriage is not about allowing someone to systematically destroy another person's self-worth, because it's easier than having a difficult conversation. What do you want me to do? Divorce her?" The question surprised me. Not because he asked it, but because of how quickly it came to him, as if the thought had been lurking just beneath the surface of his consciousness. "I want you to make your own choices, Marcus. But I want you to make them with full knowledge of who you're choosing and what you're choosing to accept." I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a thick folder, setting it in front of him. "These are copies of security camera footage, recorded phone conversations, and documentation of every attempt your wife made to have me declared incompetent or removed from my own home." He stared at the folder without touching it. "There are also financial records showing that she's been applying for credit cards using my address and social security number, apparently under the assumption that an elderly woman wouldn't notice or wouldn't understand the implications." His face went pale. "That's identity theft." "Yes, it is. She's also been telling people that she's my primary caregiver and has been researching how to obtain power of attorney over someone deemed mentally incapacitated." "Jesus, Mom. I had no idea." "You had no idea because you didn't want to know." It was easier to believe that I was becoming a burden, that I needed managing, that Briella was the responsible one trying to handle a difficult situation. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where I'd spent so many peaceful hours before they moved in, and I stopped feeling welcome in my own yard. "Your wife has been systematically working to take control of my life, my assets, and my future. She's been building a legal case to have me declared incompetent, and she's been using you as her unwitting accomplice by convincing you that I was failing. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I needed to see what you would do. I needed to know if the son I raised would protect me or sacrifice me." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear him breathing, could feel the weight of his realizations settling over him like a heavy blanket. "Where is she now?" I asked. Job hunting, or trying to. She's been turned down by every agency in the city. She keeps saying there's some kind of conspiracy against her, that someone is sabotaging her efforts. Someone is. He looked up sharply. You, me, and my 30 years of professional relationships, my reputation in this business community, and my complete inability to recommend someone who tried to destroy my life. Mom, that's really vindictive. Is it? Or is it the natural consequence of her actions? When you systematically abuse someone, Marcus, especially someone with power and connections, there are repercussions. Briella thought she was dealing with a helpless old woman. She was actually dealing with one of the most influential business owners in this city. He picked up the folder with trembling hands. What happens now? Now you decide who you want to be. You can continue making excuses for someone who tried to steal your mother's life, or you can finally understand that some actions have consequences that can't be undone. And if I choose her? Then you'll be choosing to leave with her in 12 days when the eviction is final, and you'll be choosing to build a life with someone who has no job prospects in this city, no professional references, and a documented history of elder abuse. He was crying now, silent tears running down his face as the full scope of his situation became clear. I thought I was being a good husband. You were being a complicit one. There's a difference. I walked back to my desk and sat down, returning my attention to my computer screen. You have 12 days to decide, Marcus. Choose wisely. As he left my office, clutching the folder of evidence against his wife, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years. Complete control over my own life. But I wasn't finished yet. Briella had made one final mistake, and tomorrow she would discover that some bridges once burned can never be rebuilt. Moving day arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that makes everything seem possible. I stood at my bedroom window, sipping my morning coffee and watching the moving truck pull into my driveway. Marcus and Briella had found a small apartment across town, the only place that would accept them after landlord received calls about Briella's character issues from previous housing references. I'd been awake since dawn, not from anxiety, but from anticipation. Today marked the end of the longest, most painful chapter of my adult life, and the beginning of something I'd almost forgotten was possible, living in my own home without fear, without walking on eggshells, without pretending to be less than I was. The movers worked efficiently, carrying boxes and furniture that had slowly overtaken my house over the past 3 years. I watched Briella's exercise equipment disappear, her designer clothes, her expensive kitchen gadgets that she'd somehow convinced Marcus we needed, despite the fact that I did all the cooking. Each item that left my house felt like breathing a little easier. Briella hadn't spoken to me since our confrontation 2 weeks ago. She moved through the house like a ghost, her face hollow and her movements mechanical. The woman who had once commanded every room with her presence now seemed to be shrinking daily, collapsing under the weight of consequences she'd never expected to face. Marcus was a different story. Since reading through the folder of evidence I'd given him, he'd been trying to find moments to talk to me, to apologize, to somehow undo 3 years of enabling his wife's cruelty. But some damage can't be repaired with words, and some trust can't be rebuilt with good intentions. Mom? His voice came from behind me as I stood in the living room, watching the last of their belongings being loaded onto the truck. I turned to face him. He looked older than his 35 years, worn down by the weight of choices he was finally understanding. Yes, I know I don't have the right to ask this, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry for what I let happen to you in your own home. I nodded slowly. I know you are, Marcus. Is there any way, any possibility that we could work through this? That you could forgive me? The question I'd been expecting, the plea I'd been dreading. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw the little boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard, the teenager who'd cried in my arms when his first girlfriend broke his heart, the young man who'd called me every Sunday when he first moved out on his own. I can forgive you, Marcus. In time, I probably will. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean going back to the way things were. What does it mean? It means that someday we might be able to have a relationship again. But it will be a different relationship, with different boundaries, and it will require you to prove that you've learned from this experience. He nodded, tears threatening to spill over. And Briella? What about her? She's my wife. She's destroyed, Mom. She can't find work, we can barely afford the apartment, and she's falling apart. She knows she made mistakes, but the punishment seems so extreme for systematically trying to destroy my life? I cut him off. For attempting identity theft? For elder abuse? For 3 years of psychological torture designed to make me feel worthless in my own home? When you put it like that, that's exactly what it was, Marcus. And the fact that you're still trying to minimize it, still trying to protect her from the consequences of her actions, tells me that you haven't learned anything at all. The words hit him like a physical blow. He stepped backward, his face crumpling. She's not the victim here, I continued. I am. And the fact that her life is falling apart now doesn't erase what she did to me. It's simply justice. Through the window, I could see Briella sitting in their car, staring straight ahead with empty eyes. Part of me felt a flicker of sympathy for her. She'd lost everything in a matter of weeks. But then I remembered the sound of that plate hitting the floor, the feeling of crawling on my hands and knees to clean up the mess she'd made, the systematic campaign to convince everyone that I was losing my mind. No, I'd spent too many years feeling sorry for people who hurt me. I was done with undeserved compassion. Will you at least consider giving her a second chance? Marcus asked desperately. People can change. People can learn from their mistakes. Can they? Because 2 weeks ago, after I fired her and showed her exactly who I was, she didn't come to me with apologies and remorse. She went to employment agencies trying to convince them that she'd been wrongfully terminated. She contacted a lawyer about suing me for wrongful dismissal. She told anyone who would listen that I was a vindictive old woman who was jealous of her success. Marcus's face went pale. I didn't know she was doing that. Of course you didn't. Because she's still lying, still manipulating, still trying to control the narrative. The only thing that's changed is that she no longer has power over me. The moving truck's engine rumbled to life outside. Our conversation was running out of time, and I found myself grateful for that. There was nothing left to say that would change anything, nothing that would make this easier for any of us. I love you, Mom, Marcus said quietly, despite everything. Despite how badly I failed you, I love you. I love you too, son. And maybe someday that will be enough to rebuild something between us. But not today, and not while you're still married to someone who tried to destroy me. He nodded, understanding finally settling over his features. If I made different choices about my marriage, would that change things between us? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications neither of us was quite ready to address directly. Marcus, you're a grown man. You have to make your own decisions about your life, your marriage, and your future. But you also have to live with the consequences of those decisions. And if I choose her, then you're choosing to build a life with someone who has shown you exactly who she is when she thinks she has power over vulnerable people. You're choosing to stay married to someone who spent 3 years systematically abusing your mother. That's your choice to make, but it's also mine to decide how I respond to it. He was crying openly now, the weight of his impossible situation finally breaking through his defenses. I felt a mother's instinct to comfort him, to tell him everything would be okay, to sacrifice my own needs to make his life easier. But I was done sacrificing myself for other people's comfort. The truck is ready, he said, wiping his eyes. We should go. Yes, you should. He walked to the door, then turned back one last time. Will you call me? Someday? Maybe. When you've figured out who you want to be. After they left, I stood in my living room and listened to the silence. For the first time in 3 years, my house felt like mine again. I walked through each room, reclaiming spaces that had been slowly taken from me, moving furniture back where it belonged, opening curtains that had been kept closed to accommodate Briella's afternoon naps. In the kitchen, I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the table where I'd been humiliated just 3 weeks ago. The stain on the hardwood floor was still visible, a reminder of how low I'd allowed myself to be brought. Tomorrow, I would have the floors refinished. Tonight, I would simply sit in my own kitchen and remember what peace felt like. My phone rang as the sun was setting. The caller ID showed my daughter Sarah's number. Mom? Marcus called me. He told me what happened. Did he? Why didn't you tell us you were having problems? Why didn't you ask for help? I smiled, settling deeper into my chair. Because I didn't need help, sweetheart. I needed to see who people really were when they thought I was powerless. But you suffered for 3 years. You let them treat you terribly when you could have stopped it at any time. Yes, I did. And in doing so, I learned something valuable about my son, about his wife, and about the kind of people they become when they think they have power over someone vulnerable. What are you going to do now? I looked around my kitchen, my house, my life that was finally my own again. I'm going to live, Sarah. I'm going to remember who I was before I let other people's opinions of me matter more than my own self-worth. Are you okay? Really okay? I'm better than okay. I'm free. After we hung up, I poured myself a glass of wine and walked out to my garden. The roses were still blooming, despite being neglected for 3 years. They'd survived without my attention, just as I'd survived without my family's respect. Tomorrow, I would start reclaiming not just my house but my life. I would return to my office full-time, re-engage with the business empire I'd built, reconnect with friends I'd pushed away during my exile from my own existence. Tonight, I would simply sit in my garden and remember what it felt like to be Eleanor Harrison again. Not Marcus's mother, not the old woman who lived with them, not the convenient target for someone else's cruelty. Just me. Successful, powerful, respected, and finally, at peace. As the stars came out overhead, I raised my glass in a silent toast. Not to revenge, not to victory, but to something far more precious, the rediscovery of my own worth. Some people spend their whole lives learning to stand up for themselves. At 60 years old, I'd finally remembered how to stand up for the woman I'd always been underneath the roles others had forced me to play. And that knowledge, that power, that peace, no one could ever take it away from me again. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.